It is our pleasure to be able to welcome none other than the CEO of the Perlan Project, Mr. Ed Warnock. Mr. Warnock has a Bachelor's of Science in Aerospace Engineering with honours and a high distinction from the University of Arizona and a Master's in Systems Theory. His first glider ride was at the Naval Weapons Center. It's always a memorable one. He's now a managing partner of the consulting firm Cumulus Resources and a college professor teaching executive MBA students at the University of Oregon and Willamette University. And on top of all of that, he is also the Chief Executive Officer of the Perlan Project. Ed, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's the pleasure of the Perlan Project to be able to share with all of you. Most interesting accomplishments have interesting personal stories that go along with them. So at this time, I'd like to share that personal story about our founder. Our founder was Einar Enevoldsen, and he was a glider pilot. He started very young. He made model airplanes. He made model gliders. In fact, he set a world record when he was just a teenager for a model glider duration. And Einar had an opportunity to fly at a young age, and he got hooked. He was like many of you. It only took one ride, and he was forever going to be in the air, in the clouds, exploring. He was influenced by some of glider's greatest names. Joachim Kutter came to the United States and took part in the Sierra Project, where they flew surplus gliders in the Sierra Wave. Joachim was a pioneer in flying the lee waves on the backside of mountains. Glider pilots first flew ridge lift. They understood that if the wind was blowing over a ridge or over a mountain, you could get on the upwind side, and you could ride the rising wind. Joachim was one of the first people that recognized that some of the more interesting and highest waves were on the backside of the mountain, on the lee side. And he flew into the 20,000 feet before World War II. And Einar got to be a minor participant, mostly an observer in the Sierra Project, where people were beginning to explore giant mountain waves in the Sierra. But the story of Perlan started in Germany. It started at the DLR. Einar was there flying an airplane called a Stratus 2C. It was a Grove aircraft that had multi-staged supercharging on its engines, and they were able to fly it into the 60,000 feet. He and Halu Meyer set an unofficial altitude record for turboprop aircraft. But the interesting thing didn't happen in the air there. It happened walking down the hall. And Einar saw this picture. And he looked at it and he read the altitudes on the left side. And he saw what looked like wave action up at very, very high altitudes. He went into the scientist's office and he said, "What is that?" And the scientist said, "It's a LiDAR picture. It's got a false color, but it is showing wave action over Sweden during a polar vortex event, and it showed waves that were at 75 and 80,000 feet. And Einar did some calculations, and he said, you could soar those. He had been a lifelong glider pilot. Even after he became an Air Force fighter pilot and later a NASA test pilot, he always returned to gliders. He always flew gliders as often as he could. He enjoyed gliders. In fact, I think that if we were able to ask him and say, well, which is the most fun, he would probably say gliders, even though he set a world record once in an F-104 for NASA, a time to climb record. His heart was flying gliders high. He was hooked by the Sierra Project. And he named his project Perlan, after Perlan clouds. These are polar stratospheric clouds that form at very, very high altitude. They're not made up of water vapor. They're mostly made up of compounds of nitrogen. It's very, very dry at these altitudes, but these clouds are nitrogen clouds. In fact, these clouds play a primary role in creating the ozone hole. One of the nitrogen compounds is a form of nitric acid, and the nitric acid combines with the CFCs that we've released into the atmosphere, and out of the CFCs, free chlorine is released that catalyzes the O3 back into O2. The O3 is the ozone that protects us from the radiation coming in from space. So these clouds, besides being tremendously beautiful, also are the primary driver of the ozone hole. Well, these are clouds up over Scandinavia, mother of pearl clouds or pearl clouds. And Einar, when he saw those pictures at the DLR, he said, I'm going to go soar those waves and see those clouds firsthand. And he named his effort the Perlan Project. Now, when I say he named his effort, at that time, it was just in his mind. It was just in his heart that he was going to go and climb to unprecedented altitudes with no engine at all. The first good thing that happened was that Steve Fawcett, a billionaire adventurer, heard about Einar's quest. And Steve was fascinated by it, and he contacted Einar, and he said, I would like to join you. Well, they converted Steve's DG-505M into a glider that would support pressure suits. And since Einar was a previous pilot for NASA, he was able to find somebody there who would loan him a couple of pressure suits. So with the converted airplane, they began to fly in pressure suits in a glider. They started off flying in California City, which is on the backside of the Sierras, near where the Sierra Project was. Einar went back to the familiar territory, and they began to fly. They practiced there, but they could not get very high at all. The conditions for stratospheric mountain waves is a fairly long list. Normally speaking, you need prefrontal conditions. You need a strong wind at the ridge level. Preference is for a wind about 40 knots, not too weak, not too strong. The wind needs to be close to perpendicular to the ridge line to get a good wave started. And then the secret ingredient is you need a increasing wind gradient with altitude. If the wind slows up at any altitude, the physics of wave generation cause the wave to stop at that altitude. So over many areas, you get tremendous waves on the backside of the mountains, but you can't climb them up into the stratosphere. They are capped because the wind slows up at the tropopause. So we need the polar vortex. And what the polar vortex provides is an increasing wind gradient up to 80, 90, 100,000 feet. You also need a weak tropopause. The tropopause, of course, is the boundary between the troposphere, where we are at the moment, and the stratosphere, where we would all like to go fly. And the waves tend to die out at the troposphere. Now, this is a wave model. And the red areas are rising air, the blue areas are sinking air. And you can see that on the backside of the mountain, the wind here is blowing from the left to the right. On the backside of the mountain, on this particular day, waves are going to tremendous heights. They go to the top of the atmosphere in some cases. But this happens half a dozen days out of the year. This is not a daily occurrence. It's not something where you can go to the glider port and say, hey, it's Saturday afternoon, let's go fly and let's make a stratospheric flight. You spend a lot of time sitting on the downwind side of the mountain, on the lee side of the mountain. And the polar vortex only blows in the wintertime. And generally speaking, if you're on the lee side of the mountain, you're in the desert. So you spend a lot of winter days sitting in the desert, looking at the sky, waiting for the right occurrence. Now, the right occurrence is when the polar vortex, begins to circle the Earth. It is a wintertime event. And this is the northern polar vortex, and you can see that it wobbles around the North Pole, sometimes a little further north, sometimes a little further south, but it is the driver of the wave structure that is going to push up above the tropopause. Now, where's the best place to go find these conditions? It turns out the southern hemisphere has some advantages. The polar vortex tends to occur a little further north in the northern hemisphere, which means the days are shorter and the weather is colder. In the southern hemisphere, at about 50 degrees south latitude, the weather is still pleasant enough, and the polar vortex will blow over mountains. Now, the southern hemisphere is at those latitudes is mostly water. There are a couple of places, one in South America and then one in New Zealand, where the polar vortex clips the mountains and has the possibility of generating stratospheric waves. So the first attempt was to go to New Zealand. New Zealand was a place that Einar had visited. He had ferried a Globe aircraft there at one time. And so they went near Mount Cook on the southern island, and they flew there for 3 years. They never got above 30,000 feet. In diagnosing why they didn't go higher, even though the model said they should be able to go to 40, 50, 60, 70, 80,000 feet, it turns out that if you look at the angle of the mountains in the southern island, they're not at 90 degrees to the wind. The wind would blow straight from the left to the right, and it's about a 45-degree angle. So the wave generation happened less frequently, and when it did happen, it was not as strong. And the barrier between the troposphere and the stratosphere, the waves just didn't propagate up through that barrier. They would get up to 30,000 feet, which is about the tropopause at those latitudes, and the wave would just peter out. But they tried, and they tried the next year, and they tried the year after that. It became evident that that wasn't going to work. So again, they looked at where to go, and the tip of South America is a little bit further south. New Zealand was at about 45 degrees south latitude, and the tip of South America, with good airports out of which you could fly, was about 50 degrees south latitude. So they went to a place called El Calafate, Argentina. Beautiful mountains, beautiful scenery, and they said, let's try again. So they went there in 2006, and the team deployed there. They brought Steve's 505 glider down. They had a spacesuit technician from NASA. They had weather people coming, and this crowd are all volunteers. They're people that do it for the love of soaring, for the love of flying. It turns out that all the equipment worked. They were able to squeeze back into the airplane with the pressure suits on, and they would tow out towards the mountains. And the mountains in these areas are glaciers. It's beautiful mountain country with mature glaciers that flow down out of the Andes into the surrounding lakes. They were able to find a fortunate path up through the wave field. The first year they went to South America. The green track shows how they flew. They flew the primary wave up to a certain altitude, and then it turns out that there was downwind, a secondary wave that went higher. Now, these are computer-generated models generated by a friend of the project, Dr. Elizabeth Austin, and she generates these models before they go fly, and they're able to look at them and say, is today a good wave day, and what's our strategy? So the green track is the track that Steve and Einar followed, and they flew up to over 51,000 feet, and they set a new world record for gliders. It was actually 50,722 feet. And the main importance of that flight is not that they had reached 50,722 feet. It was that they had proved the concept that, yes, you could get through the tropopause, you could link up with the higher wave structure, and once you linked up with the higher wave structure, you could continue to hopefully climb. Now, in the pressure suits, they had a predictable experience. These are emergency get-down suits that were for U-2 pilots and SR-71 pilots, and they weren't designed to inflate and then be able to operate the airplane. They were designed to inflate if you had a depressurization event and you had to get down and you had to support life on the way down. But as they kept climbing, the suits kept inflating more and more and more. They became like the Michelin Man. They kept blowing up, getting stiffer. And as they were nearing the 50,000 foot mark, they were so inflated and so stiff that they could no longer operate the controls easily. Einar said that he could not reach some of the controls in the cockpit because his arms were just inflated and stiff. So at 50,722 feet, they were still climbing, but it was getting to the point where flight operations were getting questionable because of the stiffness of the suits. They were also getting cold. Gliders, of course, are unheated, and the temperature up there was about minus 60 degrees centigrade, and they were cold. They had set a world record, and another few hundred feet or 1,000 feet or 5,000 feet weren't going to make any difference as far as their world record went, so they agreed they would come down. So they lowered the nose, opened the spoilers, and they began to come down. But they agreed that they were going to return, but they needed a different airplane. Steve's 505 had proved the concept. Yes, you could connect with these waves. And when they got into the waves, it was the first rung of a ladder that would lead higher and higher. But they needed a different airplane. They agreed that they needed to get out of the pressure suits and rely on an aircraft that was pressurized. So they hired a designer who happened to be in the state of Oregon, in the town of Bend. And he was the best glider designer that they could find. And they pitched the problem to Greg Cole. And they said, Greg, how would we build an airplane that would have the performance to be able to fly in the stratosphere as a glider and would be pressurized so that it could provide a safe environment for the pilots? They were joined by Morgan Sandercock. Morgan was a glider pilot from Australia who had heard about Steve and Einar's adventures. And when he heard that they were going to build a pressurized glider, he joined the project. And he joined not only as a worker, he dug into his savings account and he provided the money to begin to move ahead. Now, you may wonder what happened to Steve. Unfortunately, Steve died in an aircraft accident and was not continuing with the project. And so they were starting again with funding, and Morgan was the first person to step forward and say, I will put my personal savings in. I just want a chance to be able to fly in the airplane. So he's holding a pressurized hatch prototype in the shop, that says if we're going to pressurize this glider, we're probably going to have close to a 9 or 10 psi difference, and that's a lot of force on a hatch. So they designed an airplane that would fly at about 2% air density. That's the same air density as you'd find on the planet Mars. It would have to be able to withstand temperature changes of up to minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit from maybe 40 or 50 degrees when you started out the flight. Steve's original glider is hanging in a museum now, the Museum of Flight at Boeing Field in Seattle, and it's probably not airworthy. The flight to 51,000 feet cracked and crazed the fiberglass finish, the gel coat, and structurally, it's doubtful that it should ever fly again. It needs to hang in a museum, not operate at an airport. So they needed a design of a glider that they could repeat these very severe temperature shifts. So an all-carbon composite construction, a sealed cabin that was going to use passive pressurization. Since we don't have a motor, we can't have a compressor. So we're going to pressurize this like you pressurize a water bottle when you go fly. You just put the cap on, screw it down tight, and at altitude it'll be hard. It'll be pressurized. Well, they came to that conclusion that what we'll do is we'll just pressurize it at the ground, and we just won't let any air out. They also had to come up with a rebreather system to conserve oxygen. Most oxygen systems dump vast amounts of oxygen overboard. And they could not dump the oxygen overboard for two reasons. One is that that's a waste. You'd have to carry the oxygen and then throw it away. The other is in a sealed compartment, the oxygen concentration would build up. It's a fire hazard. So they designed an airplane that would fly well at 60,000 feet. They optimized the aerodynamics for 60,000 feet, meaning it would fly okay at lower altitudes and it would fly okay at higher altitudes. At 60,000 feet, it would be as efficient as it could possibly be. Notice that the higher you go, the bigger the sink rate is. As the air is less dense, the only way to generate lift is push the nose over and fly faster. And if you're flying faster and you push the nose down, your natural sink rate, the natural sink rate gets up to about 850 feet a minute, and that's the most efficiently you can fly in this glider. So the question comes up, well, how do you stay airborne if your natural sink rate, the best sink rate you can, your best L over D is going to give you a sink rate of a high rate? Well, it turns out that the waves get more energetic with altitude. The conservation of energy says if you have a mass that's moving up and down, and then the mass gets smaller, and it gets smaller because the air is less dense, it says conservation of energy says what happens? Well, the mass has got to move faster. So this graph shows from left to right, low altitude to high altitude. The green line shows the wave energy, and you'll notice the higher you go, the waves get stronger and stronger. The red line is the natural sink rate of the glider. So the natural sink rate of the glider keeps pace with the increased energetic nature of the wave. In fact, the waves can sometimes get so energetic they turn into breaking waves. They turn into whitewater at altitude. So we began to put the airplane together, and you had to, first of all, design it in CAD, then you had to make foam molds, then you had to turn the foam molds into carbon fiber parts, and then you had to assemble those into airplanes. We built two of them. We built one as a test article, so we could test it and overstress it and determine, could this handle the breaking waves? Could it handle the pressure? The final assembly was done at a nearby facility. We glued together the model airplane parts, and a pressurized glider began to appear. We did ground vibration tests. This is a brand new design that would be flying at high speeds, because the higher we go, the faster we have to fly to maintain lift. So we did a rigorous computational fluid dynamics and ground vibration tests to make sure that we weren't going to get into some flutter mode that would be destructive to the airplane. We put in enough instruments. It's instrument qualified, even though you may not want to take it on an instrument flight. We also built in flutter exciters so we could do real-time tests on flutter modes as we fly the airplane. We filled it up with enough instrumentation. We've got satellite tracking, communications, data loggers. So the airplane is getting heavier and heavier and heavier as we outfit it for becoming a spacecraft with glider wings. We also have two environments. I mentioned we don't want the cabin to fill up with oxygen, and so we put the pilots on a rebreather loop. The pilots breathe pure oxygen, but exhale it, and we make sure that none of it gets into the cabin. The cabin is normal air, and we have a scuba tank in the tail boom that if we have small amounts of leak, like the tow release cable has a small leak that we haven't been able to turn to zero. So as the pressure begins to drop in the cockpit, we let just a little bit of air from the scuba tank come in. But the pilots, they stay on pure oxygen. We have two parachutes. One is a tail chute, a drogue chute, and this is designed for upset control. If we should hit these breaking waves and the pilots say, I'm in an unusual altitude, the speed is building up, they can pop a tail chute and it gets the front end going forward again. It keeps the speed under control, and then they cut away the chute as they get to lower altitude. If there should be some problem that says the airplane is no longer flyable, we've had a structural problem, we've got a ballistic recovery system on the airplane, so we can ride the airplane clear to the ground under a parachute. So the volunteers came back to Argentina in 2016, and that was 10 years after Einar and Steve made it to 51,000 feet. And the routine for the volunteers in Argentina is mostly work in the hangar, launch weather balloons, do inspections, test things. Sometimes, when the conditions are right, we go flying. But even though this is a glider, we have to fly with great discipline. Everything is run by checklists, and nothing takes off, nothing happens unless the checklists are checked and double checked and then signed off by the test master. We have built into the wing spar a flutter system. These are eccentric weights that rotate at different speeds. And what we do is at different speeds that the aircraft has never flown at before, we shake it. And we shake it at a whole range of speeds, and we can determine if the resonant vibrations are dying out or if they are harmonic and could become destructive to the airframe. And we have a whole regime. This is a test flight envelope, and every box or every triangle is a test point. Our chief pilot is a former Air Force test pilot, and we stop at various altitudes. In fact, here's our highest flight. The star at the top is 76,124 feet. Notice as we climb, we stopped twice to do flutter testing. And the reason is we don't want to get what mountain climbers call summit fever, which is I'm close to the top, I think I'll just scramble ahead to the top. But you forget that the weather may be closing in, your oxygen is getting low. So what we do is we say we could fly higher, but we are going to stop and we are going to be test pilots now. And there are times we fly level or we even lose altitude. So on a world record breaking flight, we could have gone higher, but we couldn't have done it safely. On the ground, we have a Capcom system. We have flight engineers, we have meteorologists, and they follow the systems in the airplane. The panel with all the green are the systems that we can read through telemetry, and we can read everything from battery temperatures to the amount of oxygen in the pilot's breathing mask. And we make sure that everything stays in the green. And if it goes into the yellow or the red, then we abort the flight if it's going to be a safety factor. The pilot's safety is more important than setting a record. In 2017, we beat Einar and Steve's record by a smidgen, 54,000 feet pressure altitude. It was only 172 GPS. The plane stayed airborne for 6.5 hours, but the Perlan 2 was now the highest flying glider in history. The next year, we decided to get a tow plane that could fly us to the stratosphere. The first couple of years, 2016 and 17, we had a tow plane that would take us up to the ridge height and drop us off, and we would fly the wave from there. But it turns out in 2 years, about 20 flights, we made it into the stratosphere once. So there's a lot of time, a lot of volunteer hours, a lot of money spent, and you get one stratospheric flight. So we decided, enough of that, let's get a tow plane that would be able to make every flight a stratospheric flight, tow us up through the tropopause, take us to these high-level waves, and drop us off on the first rung of the high-altitude waves. So there's an organization in Texas, they're called Av Experts, and they own a Grobe egret, a Grobe 520, and it has a service ceiling of over 50,000 feet. It can fly slow enough that it tows the Perlan. So I always love this picture, show it to glider pilots and say, how many times have you seen your tow plane with a contrail? So we get a contrail, we get ice on the tow rope, and it is because we're towing at high altitude. And the main thing is we get through this band called the tropopause. And in this map, you can see you've got a very vigorous upper wave structure above the tropopause. You've got medium waves down at the ridge height, but you get a phenomenon because of the polar vortex where a whole new wave structure is generated in the stratosphere, and it can be stronger and bigger and go further downwind than what you see at low level. So from now on, we said to ourselves, we're going to start in the stratosphere. And the very first year we flew with the Globe, we flew to flight level 620, 656, and finally the highest altitude we've been to, 76,124 feet. And we made the world's highest aero tow at 45,100 feet. So the adventure continues, and it's accelerated by having a tow plane that can take us where the big waves are. It's like a surfer who says, I'm going to use a jet ski, and I want to go surf the really big wave, and I'll have the jet ski tow me out to where I couldn't get if I were just paddling my way on my board. So we've adopted that strategy. The scientific data we gather is absolutely fascinating. As you would expect in waves, you get very strong temperature differences between the up part of the wave and the down part of the wave. And this is a temperature plotted while we were climbing and descending. And also we've got a balloon plot that's in there for reference. But these temperature differences can play havoc with autopilots because the autopilot in flying through this, if it flies through a wave, it will have temperature shifts that many times will confuse the autopilot and cause inputs that are unexpected. Other scientific data, in 2019, we noticed that the stratosphere was getting suddenly warm. And this sudden stratospheric warming was a precursor to a weather shift in the southern hemisphere, and it led to an early and severe fire season in Australia. But it happened above everybody's head. So part of the research that the Perlan Project does, it says, what's going on in the stratosphere that we don't notice. And especially in the southern hemisphere, where there are fewer weather balloons and weather stations, the projects like the Perlan are gathering essential weather data. One of our goals is to inspire the next generation. We take time to meet with kids. Kids build CubeSats that we carry, and we many times have kids on the internet following along on the virtual cockpit as their instrument package, as their CubeSat is being flown to altitude. And the virtual cockpit shows our airspeed, our wind speed, our altitude, whether we're climbing or sinking, and we also show how much capacity is left in our life support and in our batteries. And then on the right side, we've got a Twitter feed, so we can engage kids in classrooms in glider pilots around the world. So the volunteer team posed for this picture after they had reached 124 feet. Now that's significant because it's higher than the recorded altitude of the U-2, which made a glider the highest flying subsonic wing-borne human flight in history. And that just has to make you smile. The team has also been rewarded for their volunteer work. Here's Jim, the chief pilot. He's getting an award from the Experimental Test Pilot Association. Some of our flight test engineers got a team award. We also got from the Royal Aeronautical Society a bronze team medal. And I like this one the most because it's a team medal. And they said it was for our high altitude aerodynamics and performing research in near space. One of the practical things that we are looking forward to sharing is onboard wave visualization systems that other aircraft can use. Wave systems, glider pilots know all about. We think of the air not just as blowing horizontally, but we're most interested in the air going up and down. Most pilots have little or no visibility of that, and yet if they fly into a wave field, they may not even understand what's going on. I've been on the frequency and I've heard an airliner say, unable to maintain altitude. And we're flying gliders not far away, and we want to get back on the frequency and say, move upwind or downwind a couple of miles and you'll find lift. We know that they're flying in the sink. What if they could have visualization in the cockpit like this that would say, use the lift if you can, stay out of the sink unless you're descending, and by all means don't fly through this at high speed at right angles because you'll be throwing up and down and up and down. You'll call it clear air turbulence, but you're really hitting a wave field, and it can be dangerous to passengers and aircraft structures. So what have we done? A bunch of volunteers, ANR's group of enthusiasts who joined him have flown higher than commercial airplanes without an engine, flew higher than the Concorde, higher than the U-2, and our sights are now on flying higher than the SR-71. ANR designed an airplane that would go to 90,000 feet. The official recorded altitude of the SR-71 in level flight is 85,000 feet. If we can get above 85,000 feet, glider pilots will become the highest flying wing-borne pilots in history at any speed. The SR-71 had engines powerful enough to drive the Queen Mary. The glider only uses naturally available energy. So that is the story of ANR and how a kid who got fascinated with gliders started a project that became the Perlan Project that has spin-off innovations that are going to go forward, possibly used for flight on Mars, possibly used to make airliners and fast-flying high-altitude airplanes safer, and have provided more fun than ought to be legal for a group of volunteer glider pilots. So I'll open it up now for any questions.
Wow! Oh wow! That is that was fantastic, Ed. Thank you very much for that. Looking at the history, starting off with how it all started and then finishing with the highest flying wing-borne aircraft in history as your next goal is something else, and I'm sure everyone else will agree with me. For the questions, please put them in the pictures dash general chat. You'll see a notification in there, and we'll get some questions going. I'll start off if that's okay, Ed.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind reading the questions, I can't see the notice board.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were talking about the lift, the LOVD, and putting a lot of equipment on the glider. At the moment, are you at the limits of how much data capturing equipment you can put on the glider, or can you still, with the strength of the wave, can you still increase the weight of the glider? Do you have that buffer, or are you kind of right on the limits of that?
We're at the limits. When we originally designed the glider, we thought it would weigh 1,800 pounds all up weight, and we're now flying it at 2,000 pounds. So we've made adjustments to the flight envelope to handle the extra 200 pounds. But we trade equipment out, and we're always looking for things like high density batteries that weigh less than the ones that we're carrying. And if we can save a pound, we'll put it in instrumentation. For instance, we are looking at satellite communications gear. Thales Corporation is working with us, and we're putting real-time satellite communication in the egret, and we hopefully will be able to find a light enough system we can put in the Perlan.
Sure. Okay. Next question is from Jerome. Regular gliders almost all use retractable gears. How does a fixed gear impact the Perlan 2?
That's an insightful question. We fly so slowly. Our indicated airspeed at our best climb is about 50 knots. And we did calculations of the increased weight of having a retractable system, plus the loss of the space. If the gear can't go forward because that's where the pilots are, and the pilot compartment, the pilots are sitting on the floor. It goes backwards, and that would be where we have our science equipment and our batteries and our emergency BRS parachute. So we would have had to have fattened the fuselage of the aircraft, and the calculations indicated that the drag at 50 knots is a smaller penalty than the additional structure we would have to retract the gear.
Okay. What have we got next? So from Evan H3103, he asks, you mentioned your youth engagement program. Do you offer any internships? And I guess something in addition to this question would be, if people do want to get involved, how can they contact someone at the Perlan Project to offer their expertise or just help out in general?
The first part, yes, we always take interns with us to Argentina. We pay their way to Argentina. We don't pay them a salary, so it's a tough internship if you have to work during the summer. But we've always had interns, and the interns are having remarkable careers. This has helped nudge them. One of them is working now in the hydrogen industry with the former CEO of Airbus, and they're developing hydrogen modules that can be loaded into airplanes that are going to use hydrogen for fuel. They're all having great careers, and we like to think that Perlan was a small nudge. So yes to interns. And the way to get in contact with us, if you want to volunteer or be an intern, is go to our website, and there are places that say, do you want to volunteer? Fill out a little form. Right now, we have we have lots and lots and lots of volunteers, and so it's not a case of everybody that volunteers gets to come, but we always are looking for a few good people.
Great, understood. Okay. Soaring Eagle asks, at what altitude will be your coffin corner where VNE meets the stall speed?
VNE meets the stall speed at about 100,000 feet. So at 90,000 feet, we still have a reasonable amount of tolerance and maneuverability.
Sure. Okay. 430 Stefan asks, how is the pressure of the cabin maintained around things like the control rods and tow release?
Well, the tow release has a small amount of leak, and we make it up with that scuba bottle that's in the tail boom. The control pass-throughs are pivoting. We use a series of mechanical devices that convert a forward and back motion to a rotating motion, and then we can use sealed bearings to translate the rotating motion through the pressure bulkhead into the unpressurized rear of the aircraft and wings. So we have almost no pressure loss through these pressurized bearings because they rotate, not slide.
Okay, interesting. The next question is from _Luke. I see the hatches with protection foil all the time. What are they made of? What's the reason for the rigorous protection?
The biggest enemy on a pressurized hatch is a scratch. So we keep them covered until just before we tow the glider out for takeoff. And the hatches are put in, of course, from the bottom. They're self-sealing. So the pilots hold them in place. And as they continue to climb, they seal tighter and tighter and tighter. So there are latches on the hatches, but they're just designed to keep the hatches from falling on the head of the pilot, not hold the hatch in place.
Sure, okay. K Engineer asks, was this presentation recorded? Yes, it is, and it will be available later. Just keep an eye out on the Discord and our Instagram page. Nicholas Peterson asks, how long did it take from concept to final product for the Perlan 2?
The Perlan 2 started in 2006. That's when Steve and Einar said, we need a pressurized glider. And we didn't have first flight until 2015. So it was 9 years of gaining traction and design, build, and test before we flew.
Okay, right. CL Driver 1960 asks, what is the maximum PSID and what cabin altitude would that yield at flight level 900?
Yeah, the PSI in the cabin, we're maintaining it at about 9 PSI, and that will give us about 18,000 feet cabin altitude at 90,000 feet.
Okay. Harold
We
Chevy.
were going to have a lower cabin altitude of 15,000 feet, but the pilots agreed that as we get more pressure cycles on the fuselage, that 18,000 was perfectly acceptable. So we raised the cabin altitude to 18.
Sure, 18. Harold Shevik asks, what has been the record gained altitude from the aero tow with the Grob? Does it always tow you to the wave location, or do you also get towed to medium altitudes?
We have gained about 30,000 feet was the altitude gain. In our record flight, it was a little more than that. It was almost 35,000 feet. But yes, we have the Grob tow us 50 miles from the airport to the area where the primary wave exists. So we get a free ride for 50 miles to the west. And then we don't release until we're in lift and we feel that we're in good lift. And again, like all gliders, if you lose too much altitude, you have to return to base. So we want to make sure that the egret finds a good lift point, and then we release in lift, and the egret then returns to base, and we climb.
Sure. Okay. Dr. Euphoria, Dr. Musitz asks, how different are the flying characteristics of the Perlan 2 to a normal glider at those altitudes?
Let's start at low altitude. At low altitude, the Perlan is a beast. The pilots fly with two hands on the stick, and it's because it's a heavy airplane. The control pass-throughs that I described, the rotary pass-throughs, add a certain amount of friction, and so it's a heavy airplane to fly. At altitude, it's actually easier. It gets easier and easier the higher we go. And part of it is that the true airspeed of the glider goes up and up and up, and less control input is required. And so just a small amount of pressure can initiate a turn, correct a bank, etc. So low altitude, two hands, it's a bodybuilding exercise. At altitude, it flies pretty much like a glider.
Okay, that's good. That's to be honest, that's surprising. But again, well, not surprising with the amount of engineering that goes into it. Okay, Dr. Euphoria asks, are your design limits based only on flutter, or have you seen some transonic flow behavior? And have you accounted for transonics and rare field aero in design?
Yeah, we don't have a flutter mode that we've identified yet. The 90,000 is the transonic limit. So at 90,000 feet, we get the first transonic flow separation. And it's not only that you don't want to push further, but that as the flow separates due to sonic effects, that increases the drag. So we will get an increasing drag curve as we get transonic effects. There's been some talk that we need a second pair of wings that will be a transonic wing. But right now, these wings are not transonic. And so 90,000 is the transonic limit. And that's what caused us to drop the limit. We wanted a nice round limit at 100,000 feet, but the airfoil design said 90,000 would be the transonic limit.
Sure, 90,000. Okay, Pilot Lennart asks, how much did the build of the whole Perlon 2 cost, and how much is an aerotow on your crop?
Those the cost numbers are deceiving because we use volunteers, so you can't compare what we paid, but it's in the millions. We've had private individuals, we've had Airbus become our title sponsor, and it costs millions to build and test the Perlan. It costs probably about $750,000 to deploy to South America, even with volunteers. And a good chunk of that is we have to ferry the Globe Egret all the way from Texas to the southern tip of South America. And so if you were to ask what a tow costs, if you take in the ferry costs, maintenance costs, and everything, a tow costs about $25,000. But we do a calculation that says, what does it cost to reach the stratosphere? And if you say we flew 20 tows with a very cost-effective tow plane, but we only reached the stratosphere once, and we had to go to South America twice, a stratospheric flight would cost $1.5 million. With the Egret, a stratospheric flight costs a fraction of that. So the Egret is actually a money saver if instead of counting tows, you count stratospheric flights.
Sure, okay. Henrik's one asks, is there an age limit and I guess a minimum age of becoming a volunteer?
No, we have had people as young as I think we had a 14-year-old girl who volunteered. Now she was the daughter of the egret pilot, so she had her parents with her to take care of her and supervise her in Argentina. But we've had as young as a 14-year-old.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah, and that's what it's all about as well, inspiring the next generation. And you already do quite a bit of that, as you mentioned in your presentation. Okay, we're getting to the last couple of ones now. So Ryan Cox asks, roughly how long did it take the team to design slash create the aircraft itself? I think we might have answered that.
Yeah, that's the 9-year time to design and test fly was 9 years.
9 years, okay. Soaring Eagle
Now,
asks,
we didn't work all the time. We periodically ran out of money. We're a not for profit. And we would spend money, and somebody would step forward and give us money, and we would spend all that money. Then we would run out. Like many not for profit organizations, we had multiple near death experiences where the board of directors was debating should we take all the parts of the airplane to the dump, or should we buy a big tarp and cover it up in a farmer's field because we've run out of funds, we can't go forward. And then at the last minute, before we had to take one of those two options, somebody would come forward and put in a little money, and we would go forward. And we finally got far enough that we attracted the interest of Airbus, and they got us across the finish line.
wow, wow. Okay. Soaring Eagle asks, was there an improvement in wave predictions when SkySight was used?
SkySight is a wonderful tool. We love to use Matthew Scudder's tools. In fact, Matthew has been with us a couple of times in Argentina, and his insights are invaluable. But as far as an improvement, Dr. Elizabeth Austin is our chief scientist, and she has been making the WRF models since the project began, and those models have been excellent. Matthew Scudder's SkySight has some innovations which are very useful. You can draw transects any direction through the wave field. So if you're not just going east and west, you can say, I'm going to fly at this angle, and you can look at what the wave field looks like. So the wave model themselves was not an improvement, but some of the views that we could get were quite useful that Matthew provided.
Sure. Okay. Last one. So Jonathan Goddard asks, how far can you fly in a stratospheric flight?
That's an interesting calculation. The one that I have fun thinking about is if you were at our design altitude of 90,000 feet and you have a 40-to-1 glide ratio, and at 90,000 feet you've got a 250 mile an hour tailwind, and you just turned downwind and went to your best glide, how far could you go? And the answer is we could fly out from South America, and we could go hundreds of miles out into the Pacific or out into the Atlantic before we made a water landing. We have thought about just speculatively flying high over Scandinavia in the waves Einar first saw, and then turning east over Russia and maybe refueling in the waves over the Urals and go as far as we can across Russia. That means you wouldn't have to make a water landing, but you could probably make a straight line glide that would be 1,500 miles if you kept working on gathering a little wave energy when you could.
Wow. Okay. That is mind blowing. But wow. Okay. That looks like to be all the questions. So I'll just say a couple of last things before we sign off, and then and this recording will go up on YouTube, and it will Instagram page as well. So anyone that missed any part of it, you can catch up through those mediums. So first of all, thank you to everyone that has attended this presentation. And thank you especially to Lucas and Ray for advertising this presentation on their servers as well. We understand, Discord's a great community, and it's great to have these other servers advertise our server. So for what is made to be a very important and insightful presentation. After this presentation, please stick around with us. We've got some polls in the polls channel, and we've got a picture competition as well. So stick your best pictures in there, and there's some goodies up for grabs. We also have a Condor race coming up on Monday, so that'll be in the Condor race channel. So put your name down for that. That's a fantastic way to kind of keep your flying skills in check, and have a bit of fun at the same time. And we'll have more presentations just like this in a couple of weeks. We've got someone from the BGA lined up talking about the transition from gliders to airliners. So don't go anywhere. Stick around on the server, get chatting with people, and I can imagine the Perlan Project will be a massive topic of conversation. Mr. Warnock, thank you very much for presenting today. I'm sure everyone else will agree that it's been a fantastic insight into what the Perlan Project do, and we are all excited to see what it will bring in the future. And we wish you all the best for that goal of 90,000 feet, and saying that quote of the highest flying wing-borne aircraft in history. Thank you, Ed.
My pleasure. Thank you from all the Perlan team. They enjoy sharing the story.
Fantastic. Okay, so as I said, stick around. There's a lot of like-minded glider pilots in the chat, so get chatting to them, and we'll let Ed get back to his very busy life at the moment. So thank you, Ed, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, everybody.